Well, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's Baptist Together webinar. My name is Richard Wilson. I'm the Support Services Team Leader here at the Baptist House as part of the specialist teams here offering you advice and support. Now, I have to firstly apologise. We've had a technical issue this afternoon and unfortunately Sam Coley from Anthony Collins has been having difficulty joining us. We're trying to see if we can fix that in the background, but I'm going to try and press on anyway. If you're online with us, then on YouTube, then you can ask questions via the YouTube chat function. Please do post any questions you might have in regard to today's webinar into the chat function. And I've just put up a little banner to remind you of that through the webinar. But I'm going to do my best to progress through the material without Sam. But if he manages to join the webinar partway through, then we will go for it and bring him in. But so I'll put the slides up that we're going to be using. Hopefully they're going to work, because otherwise I'm going. There we go. Sorry, I thought for a second I was going to have another technical issue. But we are going to go for this, and I will try and run this solo. As I said, I'm Richard Wilson. I'm the Support Services Team Leader at Baptist Together, and I look after various areas of our support for churches and other Baptist organisations, but particularly finance, legal, and pensions. So we're not going to be talking about pensions today. I'm sure you're relieved to hear, but we'll be trying to talk about fraud and money laundering and how to avoid that in a church environment. So we're going to try and go through the following, so an introduction, just give you a basic idea of what we're talking about. We'll try to define what fraud and money laundering are. They're going to tell you a few anonymized stories about how churches are targeted, and I'm going to also talk to you about what churches can do to protect themselves, and what you should do if you are attacked. And then we'll have a stop for questions at the end. If you have questions as we go along, please do bung them up in the chat function, and we'll see if we can answer them. I can see, I'm thankful, Anne Scott, thank you for asking a question. That just to prove it's working. I'm aiming that this will be under half an hour of presentation, and then we'll see how long the questions go on for. But if you have to leave and run out of time, then you can come back to this YouTube page, and the replay will be available, I think, essentially from as soon as it finishes. What you can do if you want to is use the controls on YouTube to scroll back and scroll forward. Obviously you can't go into the future, but if you want to ask a question, it's always best if you are watching absolutely live. Anyway, so without further ado, as I say, if you have any other questions on what we're doing, then please feel free to put them in the chat. But thanks, Anne, for that question, just to reassure me that the chat function is working, and there are some people out there. Anyway, so moving on. Unfortunately, fraud and money laundering are growing areas of crime. I've seen some statistics that even suggest that fraud is possibly the most, now that through online fraud, and is one of the largest crimes in the UK, and very frequently occurring. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of being called up at home by someone who was trying to pitch you something that wasn't entirely legitimate. And particularly as staff and organisations are working remotely, it's getting easier for people to be targeted outside of the office environment. And churches, often many of the volunteers involved are doing their church work at home in an environment where potentially are more vulnerable to being contacted out of the blue. And as trustees, so many of you, if you're a church treasurer or secretary or minister, are pretty likely to be a trustee of your church charity, and you do have obligations in this area, and Charity Commission does have some expectations that you are going to exercise due care and skill in terms of protecting yourself. Um, so we're going to try and cover off those areas and give you what you need to know. Um, so firstly, what is fraud? What are we talking about? So a fraud is an act of intentional deception or dishonesty perpetrated by one or more individuals, generally for financial gain. And there are loads of different ways fraud can be exercised. Can be as simple as a staff member putting in an expense claim that isn't entirely truthful. That is a form of fraud. But phishing can be a form of fraud. So that's sending in an email that isn't quite what it purports to be, with the aim of stealing information or potentially getting you to do something that you shouldn't, or that you wouldn't normally want to do. False president fraud. Now, the terminology is probably not very applicable to churches, but it's essentially where someone impersonates somebody often via an email address that isn't quite right. Payment diversion, where somebody tries to get you to send a legitimate payment, but send it to the wrong place. So you probably heard stories of that, where particularly solicitors firms are often targeted where they're handling funds for property transactions, so very substantial sums. Account takeover. This often is a derivative of when somebody has used a phishing attack to get your username and password and then start taking over your account, possibly your bank account or other sorts of accounts. Getting increasingly difficult to do some of that directly on say a bank account with the security measures that banks have in place, but not impossible, and something you have to watch out for. And unfortunately, we do also have to watch out for insider fraud, and that's where, as I mentioned a very simple example of insider fraud a moment ago, but you do need to watch out that you do need to have protections in place in case somebody within your organisation decides to start acting in a fraudulent manner, and unfortunately that is not unheard of in churches. So that's fraud. The second thing we're talking about today is money laundering. There is some relationship between the two, but this often is not necessarily going to leave your church out of pocket if you're a victim if you're part of a money laundering scam. But it could leave you open to some legal issues, because enabling money laundering is illegal. And there are some quite strict laws around money laundering to try and prevent it taking place. So typically what's happening in money laundering is that somebody is trying to pass money through the financial system such that its illicit origins can be disguised and it can look like legitimate earnings of an organization or an individual. So sometimes you'll see things like donation refunds being requested. Someone sends you some money and asks for it back. Donation asked to be passed on to a slightly odd looking recipient, or even something called a mule account, more common with individuals than organizations, but where someone borrows your bank account for their purposes. Not generally a good idea. But we have been stories in recent years of actually relatively young adults or even children being asked to do that for what seems to them substantial rewards, but actually can get them into some rather hot water. So anyway, less common for churches, but the first two certainly are very particular things in churches, and there are many other forms of money laundering, but we won't go into all of those today. So I've tried to just give some examples of real, unfortunately, relatively real stories. All of these, I'm not going to give any names, but unfortunately, these sorts of occurrences are real, and we really do see churches getting sometimes quite specifically attacked, not just caught up in a mass targeting. So I'll put up this full screen so you can see it better. So I'm sure some of you received these sorts of emails. Looks actually quite a lot like a real email from Amazon, and it basically says you bought something, and when you look at it, you think, I didn't order that. What's that all about? So you look down the order. Just take this off so you can see it. And it says, oh, you didn't place this order. Click on the order number to view details about this order. And so there's a link in the order number, and I can promise you that if you click on that link, you'll go to something that looks a bit like an Amazon website and asks you to enter your username and password for Amazon. Now, obviously, once somebody's got your Amazon username and password, then they probably have access to your saved payment details, and they can go off and start merrily ordering. Often what they would do in that circumstance with Amazon in particular is order a gift voucher, because obviously if they place an order on your account, then the first thing the police would look at and do and say, well, where was that delivered? And they can start, that gives them a good trail to go for. But often if people take a gift card, that adds another step in that chain that makes it more difficult to investigate. So that's a form of money laundering, and I'm sure many of you will have received emails like that in your personal email accounts, but we are seeing those increasingly in church life as well. So that's just an example, just to make you start you thinking on this topic. I talked about false president fraud earlier. Well, let me try and make that real for a church perspective. Again, let me put this up to full screen so you can maybe read it, but I'll read it out for you. So excuse my slightly twee fake iPhone screenshot. So here's what it says. Here's what the exchange says. So, hi, Reverend Mike here. I've got an urgent and sensitive pastoral situation that I need your help with. And being a good chap or lady that you are, you can text back, oh, hi Mike, what can I do? And that's probably worth noting at this point in time that on the iPhone screen, as you can see here, there's an unknown number. So I'd have thought if Mike is your minister, you might well have his number in your contact details. But this comes up on an unknown number that doesn't come up in your contacts. That possibly should throw up, oh, Mike, have you got a new number? I didn't know that. Oh, okay. But anyway, so we've got this brief exchange. So what does Mike do now? Or the person purporting to be Mike, they say, can you use the church debit card to buy a £250 Amazon voucher and text me the code? Oh, right, okay. Can't go into details, but we need to give this family some immediate help from the fellowship fund. So that's obviously a fairly urgent, trying to inject a sense of urgency into this, which obviously is a common feature in fraud activities. So so trying to encourage you to take a decision under pressure. And obviously here, if they get the Amazon code, then they're off and running. They've got some money. And unfortunately, I am aware of this is a very, very close to a real example that did happen, and it is all too easy to fall for this stuff. And so, thinking about this, how did they know who you were and who Reverend Mike was? Well, it's often surprisingly easy to find this sort of information on the public internet, maybe on your church webpage. Maybe you've got your minister's name up there. Maybe you've got your treasurer's mobile number up there. Maybe it's been on a welcome sheet at some point. Maybe it's been attached to some event. And people who are a little bit sharp-eyed tend to accumulate that kind of stuff. Maybe it's been on a Facebook page or some such. So just never, just be wary when you see these sorts of things. And I did say, unfortunately, I talk about insider fraud. So this does happen, unfortunately, and really is, we have had unfortunate examples where we've been asked to support churches that have suffered losses to people they trusted and people they thought they knew. And more often than not, this doesn't start out with somebody starting with an entirely malicious approach from the very beginning. Sometimes people fall into this trap over time, and it is a temptation that overcomes them. So sometimes you'll start seeing these these might be warning conversations. So our bank doesn't support dual authorization for online banking. So I'll do all the payments myself. It should be much more efficient. Of course, not supervised. Unless someone's actually checking the bank account, no one can tell what's going on. So maybe then it gets worse. Or how I've heard from one of our suppliers, the photocopier bill's not been paid. Is there a problem? Oh yeah, well there've been some issues with the bank, so some payments are being rejected. Don't worry, I'm sorting it out with them. Okay, and things then sometimes get sorted, and then the next thing, oh, there've been some issues with our account software, so I can't get the accounts to the independent examiner yet. And people are volunteers. You don't want them to be under pressure. So okay, that's all fine. Unfortunately, at the end of this, it transpired that the person who had taken sole control of the church bank account had been settling quite substantial bills on their own behalf, using the church's account, and the church's funds. And it started out small. It was, oh, I'm just a bit short this month. Maybe I'll just pay it from the church. I'll pay them back later. And I think, in the instance I'm immediately thinking of, I think that probably was the intent at the beginning. But of course, once it starts, that's rarely where it finishes. So this is something just to be aware of. So the challenge to think about is, if someone tried this on us, on our church, what would we do about it? So don't ask me questions about the specifics of the stories involved, but hopefully just a few stories just to illustrate the kind of situations that you might find yourself in and be vulnerable to as a church. It's probably worth mentioning that churches are specifically seen, I think, by many fraudsters as a soft target. We try to trust people. It's possibly a good part of who we are, that we accept people as they are. But you do need to have a weather eye on who you're dealing with, and are they really trustworthy. So it's probably not a great idea to have somebody who walks through your church door to become the treasurer the next week, unless you have a very strong reference for them, or from an organisational person you trust. So anyway, that's some examples of fraud. Money laundering. Well, let me try to put this one up full screen as well. So here, excuse my slightly silly naming for our potential attempted money launderer. But let me just read this email out to you in case you can't read it on screen. It's really embarrassing, but I need your help as soon as possible. Last week I made a mistake and sent the church £30,000, which was meant to be sent to our solicitors anytime bona fide conveyances as a deposit on our new house. Unfortunately, I got it wrong and sent it to Anytown Baptist Church instead. You see, ABC, same acronym, very easily done. Stupid mistake. I expect you were surprised to receive it, particularly as it would have come from my Bermudan bank account. Can you urgently refund it back to my UK account so I can send it to the solicitors, because they are hassling me? Sort code is and the account number is, as an apology for the hassle, how about you keep £3,000 for the church and just send me £27,000? It really needs to happen today or I'll lose the house. So, well, what's going on here? Well, of course, this could be a genuine error. These issues do occur sometimes, that somebody sends money to the wrong place, but you've got to be very careful and take some real strong action to check this sort of thing out. So there's a few warning signs in here. Obviously, a Bermudan bank account. Oh, that's interesting. So, from overseas, maybe not subject to the same regulatory environment about ensuring that ID checks are done on funds coming in. Doesn't want it sent back there though. Wants it sent to a UK account, which is different. So that should show a warning sign. And then putting you again, urgency, putting you under pressure. These are all things that should make you think, is this really a genuine situation? And clearly, there's one possibility that whether you know this person at all, or whether you've had anything to do with them in the past. If you haven't, then that would obviously throw considerably more concerns. Obviously, they've taken a bit of a fire if they don't know the church at all by sending you a large sum of money. But sometimes when money laundering, they want to move the money on quickly, and they're prepared to take a risk. May well be they've tried this trick on several different organisations, and clearly here, leaving you with a reasonable sum of money is almost bribing you to do what they want. I think if I saw this situation, I'd be very tempted to call the police and see what they thought of it, and obviously take some very careful steps to know a bit more about the situation to validate that it was really the case and we weren't about to be part of a money laundering ring. And it is worth mentioning that if you are knowingly open to money laundering and enable it, then that is actually a criminal offence in the UK. And what often happens, because a lot of the money laundering regulations relate to are targeted at the banking sector, it's quite possible if you enabled this that your bank may well come in and say, well, we're not prepared to support you any longer, and they would see you as a high risk customer, because banks can be subject to very substantial fines if they are seen to be enabling money laundering. So that's another salutary tale. I think the other form of money laundering that I possibly would mention here is maybe even more common in churches, is where someone comes to you and says, well, I need to send some money to this person, often overseas, but I can't send it directly myself for some reason, often a made up reason. Could I pass it to you and for you to pass on? And maybe they even claim sometimes, oh, it's a missionary I'm supporting overseas and I need it to come from a church. Clearly, in those circumstances, sending money overseas, again, another red flag on banks for potential money laundering, particularly to some jurisdictions like Africa, Far East, Middle East, Central Asia, all sorts of places that might not have the same level of banking regulation that we have in the UK and Western Europe, and so you need to be very careful in those circumstances to make sure that you know exactly where you're sending money to, and indeed, should you be getting involved in that at all, my general starting point would be the answer you should probably think no, unless you really are very convinced that you're not participating in something fraudulent or a money laundering, enabling money laundering. So anyway, those are a few examples. I'm sorry we still don't seem to have Sam on board. That's a shame, but I am hoping that I'm doing a half decent job. I'm sure he'll tell me later if he watches it back where I have failed to add some extra material. But anyway, be good. Well, hopefully you're still finding some use in this. So here's a bit more. So what can you actually do to protect yourself as a church? Well, good IT security is a good starting point. So passwords, good password discipline. So long passwords, not password 123, not sharing user accounts. Where you've got church computers, this may not always be easy to control, putting in place antivirus and security software, even just enabling the Windows security on your computers, Windows Defender is probably a good starting point. None of these are perfect. None of these will protect you from all forms of attack. In fact, many of the forms of attack that I've talked about are about getting people, what's essentially called social engineering, i.e. getting people to do things that they wouldn't normally think of doing by fooling them into doing something. Often a lot of systems, particularly financial systems, will ask you will give options to enable two-factor authentication. That makes it much harder for a third party to steal your credentials. So that might be on your email system, it might be on your on your banking system. In fact, many banks insist on two-factor authentication these days, be it sending you a text message when you log in, or having you have a keypad you have to put a number into and get a code to log in, something like that. All of these are good systems because essentially it means that even if you accidentally give your credentials to a faked website, then the fraudster still can't use that, because they will have to have the second authentication element, and unless you've also given them your mobile phone or your authentication device, then they won't be able to get anywhere. Another obvious thing that we would recommend anyway for churches, even if fraud was not a risk, is around dual authorization for payments. This is just good practice to make sure that all decisions are being taken with suitable supervision. It's not perfect because obviously two people can collaborate, and equally often we can be too trusting. So, oh, I've raised this payment, can you just approve it? The question, if you don't feel as you're being asked to do that, and you don't feel you have the information to enable you to know that's a reasonable payment, then just ask more questions. It's not unreasonable, and nobody should take offence if they are asked a couple more questions. Please, is this legitimate? Why are we paying this? These are good questions. And sometimes all it will do is uncover that somebody's signed up to something. Somebody's signed up to something and contracted for something, and all you can do is pay the bill that your church has been committed to, but at least for next time that maybe that wasn't a good decision. Training and awareness for staff, trustees and volunteers, perhaps asking them to watch this webinar just to give them some ideas of the sorts of things that they might come across. Many banks are offering webinars and training content on this because, again, they are trying to help customers avoid it. And to be honest, the number one thing is just some healthy skepticism. Just because it looks like an email's come from somebody, then just have a think. Is that out of character? Is that what I would normally expect? Maybe give them a call just to check if there's anything. If there's just anything that doesn't feel right, just take a minute and have a think about it. And similarly, if you're not sure, often just ask someone. Get a second perspective, somebody who hasn't quite jumped into the middle of it, who can just go, I'm not sure that looks right. No, or they might say, oh yeah, no, that's definitely legitimate. Sometimes some of these online systems, we had a situation yesterday where one of our trustees called me because they had a request to sign to do an online signature for a DocuSign document, and said, oh, I haven't been asked to do this today, is that right? So I went off and checked. Oh yes, no, it is definitely right. But no problem. That's great. It's good that they're thinking along those lines and checking before just doing the easy thing. So that's the sorts of things that you can do to prevent money laundering. Fraud and money laundering is just exercising that healthy skepticism and asking some good questions, as well as having the basic protections in place. And then moving on, what to do if you're attacked. I can see that Sam's joined us in the chat. He hasn't been able to get onto the webinar proper, but he is there in the chat, so he may contribute some extra points to add to what I'm saying. But what to do if you think you've been attacked? Well, firstly, don't panic. And please don't feel too hard on yourself. It is all too easy. These guys are sophisticated professionals in the main. They are experienced at trying to look right, and it's very difficult sometimes increasingly difficult to spot the difference between a real communication and something fraudulent. Notify your bank, possibly even if it's something that isn't related directly to your bank account. It's probably worth notifying them that we have had a fraud attack and attempted fraud, and we're dealing with it. But do think about that. change passwords that may have been compromised. Now, if somebody's compromised, say, your email account, now how many other passwords are reset by sending a password reset request to your email account? So often, if you've had an issue with your email account, then you might need to think about changing everything, painful as that thought might be. Consider report to the police and any other relevant agency. Action fraud is the place that we're asked to report frauds. There has been some skepticism about the effectiveness of that, but it still is the way to get engage the criminal justice system, and may be necessary if you're looking to make a claim on your insurance. If it's a significant sum of money, and it actually, and you have actually suffered a significant loss, then you probably ought to file a serious incident report. I think that's particularly important in the case of insider fraud, even if that might not have been successful. And then maybe if you have had a loss, you may find that you have some insurance cover. So do check your insurance policy, call your insurer, and they may well be able to provide you with some cover. But always better to prevent it in the first place rather than claim back money after the event. So those are a few things to do if you are attacked. I haven't seen any questions yet, so do jump in. I think we might. I'm trying to remember. That's all right. To getting towards the end of things. I did say about half an hour, and we are here at questions and answers. So if you do have a question, pop it in the chat. If you're here are a few useful references that you might find helpful in working through the topics here. So action fraud can certainly is certainly somewhere you should be reporting things. We've got a leaflet C17 on serious incident reporting, so that will be at baptist.org.uk/resources/C17. There's a link there for Anthony Collins and their faith-based charities team. So if you are looking to deal with one of these situations, you may often need some legal advice, either to yourselves as trustees and what your obligations and responsibilities are, but also perhaps maybe in taking action to recover the funds you've lost. And you're always very welcome to jump in and send us an email at supportservices@baptist.org.uk, and we'll be delighted to help you and answer your detailed individual questions. As I say, we have all these stories, unfortunately, are ones that I've heard in my time working with the Baptist Union, and it is surprisingly common. So there you go. You've had me wittering on at you for half an hour. I hope giving you something interesting and some interesting thoughts on the topic. We haven't had any questions at the moment. I can see that Sam has popped in the chat, changing passwords every 90 days, and the more complex, the better. I think it's a good methodology. There's lots of different guidance on password management and how best to manage your passwords. Certainly, don't share passwords between people, and certainly don't have a single login for your bank or whatever that everybody uses, because it can then be very hard to trace if anything does go wrong who did it. But also making sure that they are complicated and not obviously guessable. It's surprisingly how big the list of sort of what you might call fraudsters standard passwords to try is. So I think we're going to wrap it up there, unless anybody jumps in quickly with a question. We've been on for 30 odd minutes, as I promised. Thank you to you for joining us. I can see there's 30 or 40 of you out there live. I'm sure many more watching online after the event. But I've been Richard Wilson. I'll tell you what, I'll bring my face back on, because we haven't clapped eyes on you for a while. So hi. Anyway, there I'm back. Oh, thank you, Adewale. That's great. We will post the presentation on the page on our website. We can't do that onto YouTube, but we will post the presentation onto we've got a page. If you go to baptist.org.uk/webinars, we've got a page for this webinar, and we'll get the slides posted up in the next few working days. But thank you very much. Been good to talk to you this afternoon, and I hope that's been useful, and we will look forward to hearing from you if you have any further questions. If you do have any other webinars you would like to have from Baptist Together, do look at baptist.org.uk/webinars. There's a bit of a library that's built up there of ones we've done, but if there's others that you want us to do, then please do get in touch, and we will try to find a way of putting them together. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Have a great weekend.